What if I told you that someone could drown in Lake Erie and still be alive, living openly just down the highway for 23 years? What if the person you mourned, the person you buried in your heart, was actually starring in local television shows, performing at state fairs, building an entirely new family, all while you waited for their body to wash ashore? In June of 2001, a 35-year-old salesman from Akron, Ohio named Lawrence Joseph Bader went fishing on Lake Erie and never came home. His boat was found empty, drifting near Cleveland with the engine still running. No body, no blood, no signs of struggle, just an empty vessel floating on dark waters, and a family left behind to grieve. For 23 years, this case haunted Summit County. For 23 years, Lawrence Bader's wife raised their children alone, collected survivor benefits, and tried to move forward while her husband's fate remained a mystery beneath Erie's cold depths. But here's where this story takes a turn that defies everything we think we know about identity, memory, and the very nature of who we are. Because Lawrence Joseph Bader didn't drown that day in 2001. He walked away from that lake, traveled just 150 miles south to Columbus, and became someone else entirely, not as a calculated escape, but through something far more unsettling. He genuinely forgot he'd ever been Lawrence Bader at all. This is the story of a cold case that shocked 2 Ohio communities when it was finally solved in 2024. This is the story of a man who lived 2 complete lives in the same state, under the same sky, for nearly a quarter century. This is the story that made Ohio detectives, medical experts, and legal scholars question everything they thought they knew about missing persons cases in the modern era. And when that arrest finally came in the summer of 2024, when authorities confronted this man with fingerprints, DNA evidence, and photographs of a life he couldn't remember, it didn't just shock the Akron community. It shattered our fundamental understanding of identity itself. This is the Bader-Johnson paradox. This is one of the most bizarre cold cases ever solved in American history. And this story begins on an ordinary June morning in 2001, when an Akron salesman kissed his wife goodbye and headed to Lake Erie for what should have been a routine fishing trip. Let me introduce you to Lawrence Joseph Bader as he existed in the spring of 2001, before he vanished into Lake Erie's waters and into one of Ohio's most perplexing mysteries. Lawrence, Larry to his friends and family, was 35 years old that June. He lived in Akron, Ohio's 5th largest city, nestled in Summit County in the northeastern part of the state. Akron, once known as the rubber capital of the world for its tire manufacturing heritage, was transitioning into the 21st century as a diversified economy. Larry was part of that economy, working as a salesman in the area, making his living through persistence and charm. He was married to Mary Lou Bader, his wife of over a decade. Together they'd built a life in an Akron neighborhood, the kind of modest, tree-lined streets where kids played in yards and neighbors knew each other's names. They had young children who depended on him, who waited for him to come home from work each evening, who called him Dad and looked forward to weekend activities. By all accounts from those who knew him in Akron during those years, Larry was an ordinary man living an ordinary American life. He wasn't wealthy, sales work rarely makes anyone rich, but he provided for his family. He had the usual financial pressures that most middle-class Americans faced at the turn of the millennium. Some bills were harder to pay than others. Some months were tighter than others. But nothing that seemed insurmountable. Nothing that would predict what was about to happen. Larry loved fishing. It was his escape, his way to decompress from the pressures of sales quotas and family responsibilities. Lake Erie, one of the 5 Great Lakes bordering Ohio's northern edge, was less than an hour's drive from Akron. On weekends, when the weather was good, Larry would sometimes make that drive north, launch his boat, and spend a few peaceful hours on the water. For those who've never experienced Lake Erie, let me paint the picture with words. It's the shallowest of the Great Lakes, which makes it prone to sudden weather changes and choppy conditions. It's also the warmest, which makes it popular with recreational boaters and fishermen throughout Ohio, Pennsylvania, Michigan, and New York. The lake stretches over 240 miles long and 57 miles wide at its broadest point. A massive body of water that can feel like an inland ocean when you're out in the middle of it. The fishing is excellent. Walleye, perch, bass, Steelhead trout. Lake Erie's waters are rich with species that draw thousands of anglers every year. For an Akron resident like Larry Bader, it was the perfect nearby escape. Close enough for a day trip, far enough to feel like you'd left your troubles behind on shore. In early June of 2001, as summer was beginning to warm the Ohio landscape, Larry told Mary Lou he was planning a solo fishing trip. Nothing unusual about that. He'd done it dozens of times before. He'd leave early in the morning, be back by dinner, probably with a cooler full of fish and stories about the ones that got away. Mary Lou had no reason to worry. Their children had no reason to think this goodbye would be different from any other. And Larry himself, by all indications, had no plans beyond catching fish and enjoying a day on the water. But what happened on June 15, 2001, would transform Lawrence Joseph Bader from an ordinary Akron salesman into one of Ohio's most baffling missing persons cases. A mystery that would stretch across 2 decades, 2 Ohio cities, and 2 completely separate lives. The last time Mary Lou saw her husband that morning, he was loading fishing gear into his vehicle, checking the weather forecast one more time, and heading north toward Lake Erie. She expected him home by evening. Instead, she would spend the next 23 years not knowing if he was alive or dead, not knowing that he was living just down Interstate 71 the entire time, not knowing that the man she mourned had become someone else entirely. June 15, 2001. A Friday in mid-June, the kind of perfect early summer day that draws people to Lake Erie's shores. Larry Bader left his Akron home before dawn, making the roughly 50-mile drive north and east toward Fairport Harbor, a small lakeside village northeast of Cleveland where many recreational boaters launch. Fairport Harbor sits at the mouth of the Grand River, where it empties into Lake Erie. It's a popular launch point, easy access to both the lake and protected river waters. Good facilities, plenty of parking for trailers. Larry had launched from this area before. He knew the waters reasonably well. According to what investigators would later piece together, Larry launched his boat sometime around 6 or 7 that morning. The weather was good, partly cloudy skies, light winds, temperatures in the 70s. Perfect fishing conditions. He headed out into Lake Erie's open waters, somewhere off the Cleveland and Fairport Harbor coastline. And then, at some point during that day, something happened. We don't know exactly what. We may never know exactly what. But by late afternoon on June 15, 2001, other boaters spotted something concerning on Lake Erie. A small recreational boat, engine still running, drifting aimlessly in the waters off Cleveland. When they approached, they found the vessel completely empty. No person aboard. No signs of distress. No obvious damage to the boat itself. Fishing gear was still in place. Personal belongings were still there. The engine hummed quietly, still in gear, the boat slowly circling in the water the way an unmanned vessel does when it's been left running. But Lawrence Joseph Bader was gone. The discovery was reported to the Coast Guard and local authorities. By evening on June 15th, a search operation was underway across Lake Erie's western basin. Coast Guard vessels searched the waters. Helicopters flew search patterns along the Ohio shoreline from Cleveland east to the Pennsylvania border and west toward Akron's latitude. They were looking for a body. They were looking for any sign of what had happened. Clothing floating in the water, debris, oil slicks, anything that might explain how a man disappears from a running boat in calm conditions. They found nothing. When Mary Lou Bader received the phone call that evening, when authorities informed her that her husband's boat had been found empty on Lake Erie, that he was missing, that search efforts were underway, her world collapsed. One moment you're expecting your husband home for dinner. The next moment you're being told he's vanished from the face of the earth, somewhere out on that vast lake. Imagine that phone call. Imagine that moment when ordinary life shatters into nightmare. Your mind races through possibilities. Did he fall overboard? Did he have a medical emergency, a heart attack, a stroke? Was there foul play? Did someone else board that boat? Was there an accident with the fishing equipment? And beneath all those questions, the most fundamental terror. Is he suffering right now? Is he drowning in those cold waters while I'm standing here? Is he already gone? The search continued through the night of June 15th and all day Saturday the 16th. Dive teams joined the effort, searching underwater near where the boat had been found. The theory was that if Larry had fallen overboard, his body might have sunk in that general area. Lake Erie's currents and conditions meant that bodies didn't always surface quickly. Sometimes they remained submerged for days or weeks before gases brought them back up. But Saturday's search found nothing. Sunday's search found nothing. By Monday, June 18th, 3 days after Larry's disappearance, the intensive search efforts began to scale back. The waters off Cleveland had been thoroughly searched. The shoreline had been walked and examined. Divers had explored the underwater areas where the boat had been found drifting. There was simply no trace of Lawrence Joseph Bader anywhere. The prevailing theory among authorities was straightforward. Larry had somehow fallen overboard, perhaps while fighting a large fish, perhaps due to a medical episode, perhaps after losing his balance in a moment of rough water. Once in Lake Erie's waters, especially if he'd hit his head or been unconscious, drowning would have occurred quickly. His body had likely sunk and might eventually wash ashore somewhere along Ohio's Lake Erie coastline, or possibly across the lake in Canada. They told Mary Lou to prepare herself. They told her gently but clearly, "Your husband most likely drowned. We just haven't recovered his body yet. It's a waiting game now. Days or weeks from now, he'll probably turn up on a beach somewhere." Mary Lou returned to their Akron home, to their children, to the impossible task of explaining to young kids that Daddy wasn't coming home, that Daddy had gone fishing and something terrible had happened, that they might never see him again. The story made local Akron and Cleveland news. "Akron man missing on Lake Erie," ran in the Akron Beacon Journal. "Search continues for missing boater," appeared in Cleveland Plain Dealer. It was treated as a tragic but not uncommon occurrence. Lake Erie claims lives every year. Recreational boating accidents happen. Bodies aren't always recovered immediately. Within a week, the story faded from the news. Within 2 weeks, the active search efforts officially ended. The case remained open, listed as a missing persons case with Akron Police Department and Summit County authorities. But there were no leads to follow, no evidence to process, no witnesses to interview. Lawrence Joseph Bader had simply vanished into Lake Erie on June 15, 2001. And as summer turned to fall, and fall turned to winter, and no body was ever recovered from those waters, the case grew colder and colder. The only sound was Mary Lou's grief, echoing through an Akron home that felt emptier with each passing day. Let me walk you through what Akron Police Department faced in the summer and fall of 2001 as they tried to make sense of Lawrence Bader's disappearance, and why this case, despite everyone's best efforts, slipped into the cold case files within 18 months. Detective work often gets romanticized in popular culture. We see brilliant investigators finding the crucial clue everyone else missed, pursuing leads with relentless determination, cracking cases through sheer force of will. But the reality of police work, especially in missing persons cases where there's no crime scene, no witnesses, and no body, is far more frustrating. When Akron detectives were assigned to investigate Bader's disappearance in late June 2001, they started with the standard protocols. They interviewed Mary Lou extensively. What was Larry's state of mind? Had he been depressed? Were there marital problems? Financial troubles? Any reason he might want to disappear voluntarily? Mary Lou's answers painted the picture I've already described. An ordinary marriage with ordinary pressures. Yes, money was sometimes tight, whose wasn't? Yes, Larry had stress from work, who doesn't? But nothing that suggested he was planning to vanish. Nothing that indicated suicidal ideation. Nothing that made her think he was anything other than going fishing that morning. Detectives interviewed Larry's co-workers, friends, extended family members in the Akron area. They were looking for anything. Debts he hadn't mentioned to Mary Lou, affairs, secret problems, criminal connections, anything that might provide an alternative explanation to the apparent Lake Erie drowning. They found nothing concerning. Larry owed some money, sure, credit card debt, a car payment, a mortgage. Standard middle-class American financial obligations. Nothing that would make him desperate enough to fake his own death. No evidence of gambling problems, drug use, criminal activity, or extramarital affairs. His co-workers described him as reliable, friendly, average at his job. Not spectacular, not terrible. Just a guy making a living. His friends knew him as someone who liked fishing, liked beer, liked watching sports. An ordinary Akron guy. The evidence from the boat itself revealed nothing useful. When it was recovered and examined, there were no signs of struggle, no blood, no damage that would indicate an accident or altercation. The fishing gear was normal. His belongings, wallet, keys, a jacket were still on board. If Larry had planned to disappear voluntarily, why would he leave his wallet and identification on the boat? Coast Guard investigators reviewed the weather and water conditions for June 15, 2001. While Lake Erie can be dangerous and unpredictable, that particular day had been calm. There were no sudden storms, no reports of rough water in that area during the time frame Larry would have been out there. It wasn't a day where you'd expect someone to be swept overboard by waves. Detectives explored the possibility of foul play. Had someone else been on that boat with Larry? Was there a confrontation? But there were no witnesses who saw Larry with anyone else that morning. No one reported seeing another vessel approach his boat on the water. No evidence of anyone else's presence on the boat when it was recovered. Could someone have killed him on shore before he launched, then set the boat adrift to make it look like an accident? Theoretically possible, but there was no evidence of that either. No one saw anything suspicious at the Fairport harbor launch area. No witnesses reported any altercations. And again, the question, why? Larry wasn't wealthy, wasn't involved in anything that would make him a target, had no known enemies. Every investigative avenue led to the same dead end. The most logical explanation was that Lawrence Bader had somehow fallen overboard on Lake Erie on June 15, 2001, and had drowned. His body simply hadn't been recovered, which, while frustrating for the family, was not unprecedented. Lake Erie is huge. Bodies can travel miles on currents. They can get caught in underwater structures. They can, in rare cases, never surface at all. By the fall of 2001, the investigation had essentially stalled. There were no new leads emerging. The case file sat on a detective's desk, officially open but with nowhere to go. Phone calls to Mary Lou became less frequent. The hope of finding Larry, alive or dead, dimmed with each passing month. Through 2002, the case remained in that limbo state. Officially still a missing persons case. Officially still being monitored for any new information. But practically speaking, investigators had exhausted every reasonable lead. In 2003, Mary Lou Bader consulted with attorneys about her legal and financial situation. Her husband had been missing for 2 years. She had young children to support. Larry's income was gone. She was struggling to pay the mortgage on their Akron home, struggling to make ends meet on her own income. Ohio law allows a person to be declared legally dead after a certain period when they've disappeared under circumstances that strongly suggest death. Given that Larry had disappeared from a boat in the middle of Lake Erie with no subsequent contact or sightings, the circumstances certainly suggested he had drowned. In 2004, 3 years after that June morning when Larry left for his fishing trip, Summit County courts granted a petition to have Lawrence Joseph Bader declared legally dead. It was a formality, a legal necessity, but for Mary Lou it was also a devastating finality. Declaring him dead meant accepting he was never coming home, never walking through that door, never explaining what happened out on that lake. The declaration meant Mary Lou could collect on Larry's life insurance policy. It meant she could receive Social Security survivor benefits for herself and their children. It meant she could start trying to move forward, financially and emotionally, from the tragedy that had struck their Akron family in June 2001. The case was moved to Akron Police Department's cold case files in late 2004. Not officially closed, missing persons cases are never truly closed, but no longer actively investigated. The file gathered dust on a shelf in Summit County, one of hundreds of unsolved cases, one of dozens of missing persons whose fates remained unknown. Mary Lou stayed in their Akron home, raising their children alone. She became known in her neighborhood, in her community as the widow, the woman whose husband had drowned in Lake Erie, the woman who'd never gotten closure, never gotten to bury a body, never gotten final answers. She kept Larry's belongings. She kept photographs displayed in their home. She kept his memory alive for their children, telling them stories about their father, making sure they knew who he'd been even though he'd vanished when they were so young. And every June 15th, on the anniversary of his disappearance, Mary Lou would think about that morning, that goodbye, that moment when her ordinary life had shattered. She would wonder what had happened out on those waters. She would wonder if he'd suffered. She would wonder if his body was still out there somewhere, deep in Lake Erie, waiting to be found. What Mary Lou couldn't have known, what no one in Akron knew, what no detective investigating the case could have imagined, was that Larry hadn't drowned at all. That while she mourned in their Akron home through 2001, 2002, 2003, and beyond, her husband was alive and well just 150 miles south. That while the case file gathered dust in Summit County, Larry was building an entirely new life in Columbus, Ohio. That while she collected survivor benefits as a widow, he was performing at Ohio state fairs, appearing on Columbus television, marrying another woman, raising another child. That he was visible, public, searchable online, and yet completely invisible to everyone looking for him. Because the man living in Columbus didn't know he was Lawrence Bader. He had no memory of Akron, no memory of Mary Lou, no memory of Lake Erie or that June morning in 2001. He genuinely believed he was someone else entirely. And that's where this story takes its most shocking turn. While Mary Lou mourned in Akron, while detectives filed away the cold case in Summit County, while Lawrence Bader's children grew up without their father, something extraordinary was happening 150 miles south in Columbus, Ohio. Within days, perhaps within hours, of Larry's disappearance from Lake Erie in mid-June 2001, a man appeared in Columbus who called himself John Johnson. More specifically, John Fritz Johnson, though most people in Columbus would come to know him simply as Fritz. This man had no identification, no memory of where he'd come from, no recollection of his life before arriving in Ohio's capital city. He knew his name was Fritz Johnson, or at least that felt like his name. But everything before Columbus was a blank. No childhood memories. No family memories. Nothing. Now, if you're thinking this sounds like something out of a soap opera or a mystery novel, I understand your skepticism. Complete amnesia, the kind where you forget your entire life, your identity, everything, is extraordinarily rare. It's called dissociative fugue or psychogenic amnesia, and neurologists will tell you it almost never happens the way it's portrayed in popular media. But here's what makes the Bader-Johnson case so compelling and so disturbing. Whether it was genuine neurological amnesia, psychogenic dissociation, or the most elaborate deception ever maintained, Fritz Johnson built a complete, public, documented life in Columbus for 23 years, a life that existed in plain sight, a life that would have been easy to find if anyone had thought to look just down Interstate 71. In those first years of the 2000s, Fritz Johnson became a known figure in Columbus. He had a remarkable talent: archery. Specifically, exhibition archery, the kind of showy, impressive demonstrations that draw crowds at fairs and public events. Fritz could shoot arrows with stunning accuracy. He could perform trick shots that amazed audiences. He could split arrows Robin Hood style, hit moving targets, demonstrate techniques that ranged from traditional archery to modern compound bow exhibitions. It was a skill set that made him perfect for the Renaissance Fair circuit, for Ohio State Fair demonstrations, for local festivals and community events throughout Franklin County and Central Ohio. Through the mid-2000s, Fritz Johnson became a regular fixture at the Ohio State Fairgrounds in Columbus. If you attended the Ohio State Fair between 2005 and 2024, there's a decent chance you saw Fritz perform. He'd be in the arena or at a demonstration area, bow in hand, calling out his shots, engaging with the crowd, showing off skills that seemed almost superhuman in their precision. He appeared on local Columbus television stations. Local news segments featured Columbus's archery king, demonstrating his talents. Local talk shows brought him on as an interesting personality. Columbus Dispatch newspaper articles profiled this charismatic character who'd become such a beloved part of the Franklin County event scene. And here's what's crucial to understand. Fritz Johnson wasn't hiding. He wasn't using a carefully constructed false identity to stay under the radar. He was publicly visible, his face was on television, his name was in newspapers, his performances were advertised on event websites and social media. You could Google Fritz Johnson Columbus Archery and find him. You could see his face in photos and videos online. For 23 years, he was right there, visible to anyone who looked. In 2005, Fritz met a woman in Columbus named Nancy Zimmer. They fell in love, or at least they developed the kind of relationship that leads to marriage. Nancy knew Fritz as this charming, talented archer with a mysterious past. He told her he had amnesia, that he didn't remember his life before Columbus. But that wasn't necessarily alarming. People start over in new cities all the time. Not everyone has a conventional background. They were married in Columbus in 2005, 4 years after Larry Bader disappeared from Lake Erie. The wedding was a Franklin County ceremony, legal and documented. Fritz Johnson married Nancy Zimmer and began building a family life in Columbus, just as he'd built his public performance persona. In 2007, they had a son. Fritz became a father again, though he had no memory of being a father before, no memory of the children he'd left behind in Akron. He raised his Columbus son through the late 2000s and into the 2010s, teaching him archery, bringing him to performances, building those father-son memories and traditions that define childhood. Imagine Fritz's life in Columbus during those years. He'd wake up in his Columbus home with Nancy beside him. He'd practice his archery, prepare for upcoming performances at Ohio events. He'd drop his son off at school in Franklin County, the same way millions of ordinary fathers do. He'd perform at the Ohio State Fairgrounds, hear the applause, feel the satisfaction of a crowd amazed by his skill. He'd come home in the evening to his Columbus family, have dinner, watch his son grow from infant to toddler to child to teenager. He'd file taxes as Fritz Johnson. He'd have a Columbus driver's license, Columbus utility bills, a Columbus address. His life was fully documented, fully real, and he had absolutely no idea that 150 miles north in Akron, another family, his original family, mourned him as dead. No idea that he'd been Lawrence Bader. No idea that Mary Lou existed, that his Akron children existed, that an entire previous life existed in his past. Think about what that means for a moment. Every day, Fritz Johnson woke up as Fritz Johnson. Every memory he could access began in Columbus in June 2001. His identity, his sense of self, his understanding of who he was in the world, it all started in Columbus. Akron might as well have been another planet. Mary Lou might as well have been a stranger. His Akron children might as well have never been born. Whatever had happened on Lake Erie that June morning in 2001, whether it was neurological trauma, psychological break, deliberate deception, or something medical science still doesn't fully understand, it had created a complete separation between Lawrence Bader and Fritz Johnson. 2 men, 2 lives, 2 families, 2 Ohio cities, same person. Through the 2010s, Fritz continued his Columbus life. He became more established in the Central Ohio community. His reputation as Columbus's archery king grew. More events wanted him to perform. More local media wanted to feature him. He was becoming a regional celebrity of sorts, not famous in the Hollywood sense, but known and beloved in Columbus and surrounding Franklin County. He maintained his relationship with Nancy. He raised their son, watching him grow through elementary school into middle school into high school. He had friends in Columbus, community connections, a full social life. He had favorite restaurants in Columbus, favorite places to practice archery, routines and rituals that defined his daily existence. Meanwhile, up in Akron, Mary Lou's children were growing up too. Larry's Akron kids, who'd been young when he disappeared, were becoming teenagers, then young adults. They graduated high school. They moved on with their lives. They created memories and milestones that their father should have been present for but wasn't. Mary Lou watched her children grow without their father. She attended graduations alone. She helped them through teenage challenges alone. She saw them become adults, get jobs, perhaps start families of their own. All without Larry there to share those moments. And the whole time, just down I-71, Fritz Johnson was doing the same thing with his Columbus son, creating a parallel fatherhood that existed simultaneously with the fatherhood he'd abandoned in Akron, even if unknowingly. This parallel existence continued year after year. 2010, 2015, 2020. Through presidential elections and technological changes, through the rise of social media and smartphones, through a global pandemic that shut down events in 2020 and 21, through all the markers of modern American life, Fritz Johnson existed in Columbus while Lawrence Bader remained dead in Akron. In 2018, Fritz faced a serious medical crisis. He developed cancer, specifically eye cancer caused by a brain tumor. He was treated at Ohio State University Medical Center in Columbus, one of the premier medical facilities in Ohio. The cancer required aggressive treatment. Fritz lost an eye in the process, a devastating blow for an archer whose skill depended on precise depth perception and visual accuracy. But even this medical crisis, even the extensive treatment and tests at OSU Medical Center, even the brain scans and neurological evaluations that came with treating a brain tumor, none of it triggered any return of his previous memories. Fritz Johnson underwent extensive medical examination and emerged still Fritz Johnson, with no recollection of ever being anyone else. The brain tumor, as we'll discuss later, would become crucial to understanding this case, because neurologists would later theorize that this tumor, discovered in 2018 but likely growing for years, possibly since 2001, might have been the physical cause of Fritz's amnesia, that the same tumor that caused his eye cancer might have been pressing on memory centers in his brain, preventing him from accessing his life as Lawrence Bader. But in 2018, when the tumor was discovered and treated, that connection hadn't been made yet. Fritz was just a Columbus archer fighting cancer, trying to maintain his performance career despite losing an eye, adjusting to his new physical reality, while his wife Nancy supported him through treatment. By early 2024, Fritz Johnson was 60 years old. His son was 16, nearly grown. His marriage to Nancy had lasted almost 20 years. His life in Columbus had existed for nearly 23 years, longer than his documented life as Lawrence Bader in Akron had lasted. If you'd asked Fritz Johnson who he was in early 2024, he would have told you his story. He was an archer and performer living in Columbus. He'd been there since 2001, though his memories before that were unclear due to some kind of amnesia. He was married to Nancy. He had a teenage son. He'd beaten cancer. He was still performing when events wanted him, still connected to the Ohio Fair and Festival circuit, still Columbus's archery king, even in his 60s. That's who Fritz Johnson believed he was. That's who everyone in Columbus knew him as. That's what the documentation, 23 years of documents, confirmed him to be. But in the spring of 2024, his two lives, the life he remembered in Columbus and the life he'd forgotten in Akron, were about to collide in the most shocking way possible. And when they did, it would shake two Ohio communities, dominate state and national news, and force everyone involved to confront profound questions about identity, memory, and what it means to be yourself when you can't remember who you were. Spring 2024. 23 years after Lawrence Bader vanished from Lake Erie. 23 years of Fritz Johnson living openly in Columbus. 23 years of Mary Lou mourning in Akron. And then, one ordinary weekend at the Ohio State Fairgrounds, the impossible happened. A woman from Akron, now in her 50s, was visiting Columbus for the weekend. She was one of Lawrence Bader's nieces, his sister's daughter, someone who'd known Uncle Larry well before his disappearance in 2001. She'd been a young woman back then, in her 20s or 30s. Now she was middle-aged, with her own life, her own responsibilities. She decided to attend an event at the Ohio State Fairgrounds, a venue that's been a Columbus institution for over a century and a half. Maybe she was there for a specific event, maybe just browsing vendors and demonstrations. Whatever brought her there, she found herself watching an archery demonstration. The archer was a 60-year-old man who moved with practiced precision despite being older now, despite having lost an eye to cancer years earlier. He was engaging with the crowd, showing off his skills, doing what he'd done at these fairgrounds for over 2 decades. His name tag, his introduction, identified him as Fritz Johnson, Columbus's beloved archery performer. And as Larry Bader's niece watched this man perform, as she saw his face at different angles, as she observed his mannerisms and the distinctive way he moved, something clicked in her brain. A flash of recognition so powerful it stopped her in her tracks. The face was older, of course it was, 23 years had passed. The eye was missing, that was different, that wasn't how she remembered him. But the underlying features, the structure of his face, the way he held himself, the precise way he drew a bow, it was all hauntingly familiar. She'd grown up around her Uncle Larry. She'd seen him at family gatherings, holiday celebrations, summer barbecues in Akron. She'd watched him teach her younger cousins, his own children, various skills and activities. She knew his face, his expressions, his mannerisms in the way you know family members, etched into memory from years of interaction. And now, in the spring of 2024 at the Columbus Fairgrounds, she was looking at those same features, those same mannerisms, in a man who supposedly wasn't her uncle, in a man who called himself Fritz Johnson, in a man performing archery for Columbus crowds. Imagine the cascade of thoughts racing through her mind in that moment. Her Uncle Larry had drowned in Lake Erie in 2001. That was the family story. That was what everyone in Akron believed. Aunt Mary Lou was a widow. Her cousins had grown up without their father. The case was closed, not legally closed, but closed in the sense that everyone had accepted Larry was dead. His body lost somewhere in Lake Erie's depths. But what if he wasn't dead? What if this Columbus archer, living openly just down the interstate, performing at public events, was actually her uncle? What if Lawrence Bader had somehow survived that day on Lake Erie and had been living in Columbus this entire time? It seemed impossible. Seemed insane. How could someone disappear in Akron, be declared dead, mourned for over 2 decades, and actually be alive and publicly performing just 150 miles away? How could no one have made this connection before? How could Aunt Mary Lou have been collecting survivor benefits while Uncle Larry was on television in Columbus? And yet, looking at Fritz Johnson's face, watching him move, seeing those unmistakable familial features, she couldn't shake the conviction that she was looking at her uncle. She had a decision to make in that moment. She could dismiss it as coincidence, as wishful thinking, as her mind playing tricks. After all, 23 years was a long time. People can look similar. She'd been a young woman when Larry disappeared. Maybe her memories weren't as reliable as she thought. Or she could trust her instincts. She could act on this recognition, even knowing how crazy it would sound, even knowing she might be wrong, even knowing the emotional upheaval it would cause if she was right. She chose to trust her instincts. After the archery demonstration ended, she approached close enough to see Fritz Johnson more clearly. She didn't confront him directly. What would she even say? "Excuse me, are you my uncle who supposedly drowned 23 years ago?" But she watched him interact with others, tried to hear his voice, absorbed every detail she could. The more she observed, the more convinced she became. This wasn't just resemblance. This wasn't just coincidence. This was her Uncle Larry, aged and changed by over 2 decades, but unmistakably him. She returned to Akron that weekend with her mind racing. Should she tell Aunt Mary Lou? Should she contact the police? What if she was wrong and put the family through devastating false hope? What if she was right and revealed that Uncle Larry had faked his death, abandoned his family, and been living a secret life in Columbus? She decided to go to the authorities first. Let professionals investigate. Let them determine if this Fritz Johnson really was Lawrence Bader, or if she'd seen a resemblance that didn't mean what she thought it meant. In early April 2024, she contacted the Akron Police Department. She asked to speak with someone about a cold case. She was directed to the cold case unit in Summit County. And when detectives sat down with her, she told them an almost unbelievable story. "I think I found my uncle who disappeared in Lake Erie in 2001. I think he's alive. I think he's living in Columbus, performing as an archer at the state fairgrounds. I know how this sounds, but I'm telling you I saw him. I recognized him. You need to investigate this." The detectives could have dismissed her. Cold case units get tips all the time. Many of them are dead ends, wishful thinking, or mistaken identity. A woman claiming her dead uncle was actually alive and performing publicly in Columbus for 23 years? It sounded like a fantasy, like denial, like anything except a credible lead. But these were experienced investigators. They'd learned over years of police work that sometimes the most unlikely tips turn out to be true. And this woman seemed credible, seemed sure, seemed to understand how extraordinary her claim was, and yet remained convinced of what she'd seen. So they decided to investigate. They pulled out the dusty case file on Lawrence Joseph Bader, missing from Lake Erie, June 2001, declared dead in 2004. They reviewed the old photographs of Larry from before his disappearance. And then they searched for information about Fritz Johnson, archer in Columbus. And what they found shocked them to their core. Fritz Johnson wasn't hard to find. He was all over the internet. Columbus newspaper archives, local television news segments, event advertisements, social media posts from Ohio fairs and festivals, photographs and videos showing this 60-year-old archer performing at Columbus venues. When the Akron detectives compared these recent photos and videos of Fritz Johnson with the old photos of Lawrence Bader from 2001, they saw what the niece had seen. The resemblance was striking. More than striking, it was the same facial structure, the same features aged by 23 years. But resemblance isn't proof. Lots of people look similar. For all they knew, Fritz Johnson was someone who just happened to look like Lawrence Bader. They needed more. They needed definitive proof. They needed fingerprints. They needed DNA. And to get that, they needed to go to Columbus. In mid-April 2024, Akron Police Department detectives made the roughly 2-hour drive south on Interstate 71 to Columbus, Ohio. They coordinated with Columbus Police Department. This was CPD's jurisdiction, after all. They couldn't just roll into Franklin County and start questioning residents without local law enforcement cooperation. Columbus detectives were briefed on the situation. Akron had a 2-decade-old cold case involving a man presumed drowned in Lake Erie. They had a lead, admittedly a wild lead, that this missing person might actually be alive and living in Columbus as Fritz Johnson, a local archer and performer. The Columbus detectives knew Fritz Johnson, or at least they knew of him. He was a fixture at local events, a recognizable character in the community. The idea that this beloved local performer was actually a missing person from Akron seemed almost absurd. But Akron had evidence, those side-by-side photos, that demanded investigation. The plan was straightforward. Locate Fritz Johnson, arrange an interview, obtain fingerprints and DNA samples for comparison against Lawrence Bader's records. If it was a match, they'd have their answer. If it wasn't, they could close this bizarre lead and move on. In late April 2024, detectives contacted Fritz Johnson and requested an interview. They didn't reveal the full reason initially, just that they needed to speak with him regarding an ongoing investigation. Fritz agreed. Why wouldn't he? He had no reason to avoid police. He'd done nothing wrong that he knew of. He was a law-abiding Columbus resident. The interview took place at a Columbus police facility. Fritz Johnson, now 60 years old, sat down with detectives from both Columbus and Akron. They explained that they were investigating a missing persons case from Akron, and that his name had come up as potentially having information. Could he help them? Would he consent to fingerprinting and a DNA swab? Fritz was confused but cooperative. He didn't know anything about missing persons in Akron. He'd lived in Columbus since 2001. He had amnesia regarding his life before that, but he'd never been to Akron as far as he knew. Still, if it would help their investigation, sure, they could fingerprint him and take a DNA sample. This is where the story gets procedural, but bear with me because these details matter enormously. Fingerprints from Fritz Johnson were taken at the Columbus facility in late April 2024. The DNA swab was collected according to standard protocols. These samples were then sent to the Ohio Bureau of Criminal Investigation, the BCI, which handles forensic analysis for law enforcement agencies throughout Ohio. Meanwhile, detectives obtained Lawrence Bader's old fingerprint records from 2001. They had DNA samples stored from when Bader was declared dead in 2004, samples that had been preserved in case a body was ever found that needed identification. These were pulled from storage and submitted to BCI for comparison. Now, forensic analysis takes time. This isn't like television where results come back in an hour. DNA comparison, especially when you're being thorough and careful, can take days or weeks. Fingerprint analysis is faster but still requires expert examination and verification. The detectives waited. Mary Lou in Akron was informed that there was a potential lead in her husband's case, but was told not to get her hopes up. It was probably nothing, probably a dead end like so many leads before. Fritz Johnson in Columbus went back to his life, probably thinking this was a strange but minor interruption, probably figuring the police would realize their mistake and move on. In early May 2024, the results came back from the Ohio Bureau of Criminal Investigation. The fingerprints were a perfect match. Fritz Johnson's prints and Lawrence Bader's prints. Identical. Same person. The DNA was a perfect match. Fritz Johnson's DNA and Lawrence Bader's DNA. Identical. Same person. John Fritz Johnson, beloved Columbus archer, husband to Nancy, father to a 16-year-old son, Columbus resident for 23 years, was Lawrence Joseph Bader, presumed drowned in Lake Erie in June 2001, declared legally dead in 2004, mourned by his Akron family for over 2 decades. It wasn't mistaken identity. It wasn't coincidence. It wasn't a look-alike. The man who'd been performing at Ohio State fairs, appearing on Columbus television, living openly in Franklin County, was the same man who disappeared from that boat 23 years earlier. Lawrence Bader was alive. And he'd been alive, living publicly in Ohio, just down the interstate from his grieving family, the entire time. When Akron detectives received this confirmation in May 2024, they faced a situation unlike anything in their careers. This wasn't a typical cold case resolution. This wasn't finding a body, identifying a killer, solving a murder. This was discovering that a man declared dead was actually alive, and had been living a completely different life in a different Ohio city for over 2 decades. The questions cascaded immediately. How was this possible? Had Bader faked his death deliberately? If so, why? And how had he maintained this Fritz Johnson identity for 23 years without anyone making the connection? If he hadn't faked it, if something else had happened, then what? And what laws had been broken? Was this insurance fraud? Bigamy? Abandonment? Identity theft? But before they could tackle any of those legal and procedural questions, they had a more immediate concern. They had to inform Mary Lou. They had to tell a woman who'd been a widow for 20 years that her husband was alive. They had to tell children who'd grown up without their father that he'd been living in Columbus the whole time. Imagine being the detective who has to make that call. How do you even begin that conversation? Mrs. Bader, we have news about your husband's case. He's alive. He's been living in Columbus for 23 years. No, I'm not joking. Yes, I'm absolutely certain. We have fingerprints and DNA confirming it. The notification happened in May 2024. Mary Lou's reaction, what she said, how she processed this impossible news, hasn't been fully disclosed publicly. But can you imagine? 23 years of grief, of raising children alone, of financial struggle, of wondering what happened on that lake, of eventually accepting he was gone and trying to move forward with your life, and then learning he'd been alive the entire time just down I-71, building a new family while you mourned him? The rage, the confusion, the betrayal, the relief that he's alive mixed with fury that he left. The questions. Did he do this deliberately? Does he remember me? Why didn't he come back? How could he abandon his children? And simultaneously, they had to inform Nancy Zimmer in Columbus that the man she'd married in 2005, the man she'd been with for nearly 20 years, the father of her teenage son, was actually someone else entirely. That Fritz Johnson was Lawrence Bader. That he had another wife in Akron. That he had other children. That their entire life together was built on an identity that wasn't fully real. The story broke in local Ohio media in late May 2024. Akron man declared dead in 2001 found alive in Columbus. The headlines seemed impossible, like something from a tabloid or a fiction novel. But every word was documented, verified, true. By June 2024, 23 years almost to the day after Larry's disappearance from Lake Erie, the story had gone viral. National news outlets picked it up. CNN, Fox News, MSNBC, network morning shows. TikTok videos explaining the case got millions of views. Reddit threads dissected every angle. True crime podcasts devoted episodes to analyzing what had happened. Arrest shocks community, the headlines proclaimed, though arrest was somewhat misleading in this context. But there's no denying the shock. Both communities, Akron and Columbus, were reeling. In Akron, people who'd known the Bader family, who'd watched Mary Lou struggle as a single mother, who'd attended memorials and offered condolences, were stunned to learn Larry had been alive all along. How could he have done this to his family? How could he have let them suffer while he lived a new life? In Columbus, people who'd known Fritz Johnson for years, who'd watched his performances, who'd considered him a beloved local character, were equally shocked. Fritz Johnson wasn't real. He was actually someone from Akron who'd disappeared? Had he been lying to everyone for 23 years? And at the center of all this media frenzy, all this public speculation and outrage, sat a 60-year-old man who was about to face the most devastating confrontation of his life. June 2024. Ohio authorities arranged for a formal interrogation, though interrogation isn't quite the right word for what was about to happen. This wasn't questioning a suspect in a crime, at least not in the traditional sense. This was confronting a man with evidence that he was someone else, someone he had no memory of being. Fritz Johnson was brought to Akron Police Headquarters in Summit County. The drive from Columbus to Akron, that same 2-hour stretch of I-71 that separated his two lives, must have been surreal for him. He knew by this point that police believed he was this missing person, this Lawrence Bader. He'd been told about the fingerprint and DNA matches, but he had no memory of being Lawrence Bader. None whatsoever. In the interrogation room, again, let's use that word even though this situation was unlike any standard interrogation, detectives laid out the evidence. Not just fingerprints and DNA, but photographs. Visual proof of who he'd been. They showed him photographs of Lawrence Joseph Bader from the late 1990s and early 2000s. A younger version of his own face stared back at him from these pictures. The features were undeniably his, just 23 years younger, with both eyes intact, looking healthy and ordinary in the way people look in family photos. They showed him photographs of Mary Lou, a woman he'd supposedly been married to, supposedly loved, supposedly built a life with in Akron before June 2001. He looked at her face and felt nothing. No recognition. No memory. She was a complete stranger to him. They showed him photographs of children, his children from Akron, now grown adults in their 30s. Baby pictures, childhood photos, school portraits spanning the years before he disappeared. These were people who shared his DNA, people he'd helped create, people who should trigger some parental recognition instinct. He looked at their faces and saw strangers. They showed him photographs of his Akron home, the house he'd lived in with Mary Lou and the kids, the neighborhood streets he'd driven daily, the places he'd worked, the locations that should have been familiar territory. He stared at these images and they meant nothing. He'd never seen these places before, as far as his memory was concerned. Detectives walked him through his timeline as Lawrence Bader. Born in such and such year in Ohio. Grew up in this area. Attended these schools. Got this job. Married Mary Lou in this year. First child born this year. Second child born this year. Financial struggles in the late 90s, early 2000s. The fishing trip to Lake Erie on June 15, 2001. Do you remember any of this? They asked him. No, Fritz Johnson replied. And by all accounts from investigators present, his confusion was genuine. This wasn't someone caught in a lie and trying to maintain a cover story. This was someone being told they had an entire life they couldn't remember, confronted with photographic proof of a past that felt like it belonged to a different person. They brought in handwriting samples. Lawrence Bader's signature on documents from before 2001. They had Fritz Johnson sign documents. Handwriting analysis would later show the signatures matched. Subtle variations from 23 years and possibly neurological changes, but fundamentally the same hand, the same person. They showed him records of Mary Lou collecting survivor benefits since 2004. Life insurance payouts. Social security payments. Your wife collected death benefits for 20 years because you were declared dead, they explained. She thought you drowned in Lake Erie. The whole time you were in Columbus. Fritz absorbed this information with what witnesses described as genuine distress. Not guilt, exactly. How can you feel guilty for something you don't remember doing? But distress at the implications, at the pain his existence had apparently caused, at the impossibility of his situation. I don't remember her, he kept saying. I don't remember Akron. I don't remember any of this. I'm Fritz Johnson. I've been Fritz Johnson since 2001. That's all I know. That's all I've ever known. The detectives pushed. They had to. This was too extraordinary, too convenient. You're telling us you have no memory of your entire life before Columbus? No childhood memories, no memories of your parents, your siblings, your wife, your children? Nothing. Nothing, Fritz confirmed. I woke up, not literally woke up, but became aware, became myself, in Columbus in June 2001. Everything before that is blank. I've lived with that blank my whole adult life. I've never known where I came from. I've never been able to remember my past. That's just been my reality. Detectives consulted with psychologists and neurologists. Is this even possible? Can someone really lose their entire memory like this? The experts gave complicated answers. True dissociative fugue is rare but documented. Severe retrograde amnesia from trauma is possible. Brain injuries or tumors can cause memory loss. But total amnesia of your entire previous life, maintained for 23 years? That's extraordinarily rare. And here's where the skepticism naturally arose, both in the interrogation room and in public discourse as this story broke nationally. Was Fritz Johnson, Lawrence Bader, lying? Was this elaborate amnesia claim just a cover story for a man who deliberately faked his death to escape debts, abandon his family, and start over? The circumstantial evidence for that theory seemed compelling. Lawrence Bader had financial troubles in 2001. Not catastrophic, but stressful. Credit card debt, mortgage pressure, the normal financial strain of middle-class life that sometimes makes people desperate. He goes out on Lake Erie alone on a solo fishing trip, the perfect opportunity to stage a disappearance. Leave the boat running and empty. Make it look like you fell overboard. Swim to shore somewhere, hitchhike or walk away. Start fresh in Columbus with a new identity. For 23 years he maintains this Fritz Johnson persona, builds a new life, stays just far enough from Akron to avoid chance encounters but close enough that it's convenient. He never reaches out to Mary Lou or his children because that would blow his cover. He creates a backstory about amnesia to explain why he has no documented past before 2001. It's the perfect crime in a sense. Escape your old life completely. Let your family move on. Sure, they suffer, but people recover from grief eventually. Start fresh without the baggage of debt, marriage problems, whatever was making you unhappy in Akron. And if you're ever caught, just claim amnesia. How can anyone prove you're lying about what you remember? But here's the problem with that theory. The evidence suggests Fritz Johnson genuinely didn't know he was Lawrence Bader before police confronted him in 2024. He'd been living completely openly in Columbus for over 2 decades. He was on television, in newspapers, at public events. His face was searchable online. He used Fritz Johnson as his legal name, filed taxes under that name, had a driver's license with that name. If you're deliberately hiding your identity, you don't become a public performer. You don't get featured on local TV. You don't do anything that puts your face out there for potential recognition. You stay quiet, anonymous, invisible. Fritz Johnson did the opposite. He was highly visible for 23 years. Moreover, the psychological and psychiatric evaluations conducted in summer 2024 found no evidence of malingering, the technical term for faking symptoms. The experts who examined Fritz Johnson concluded that his reported amnesia was consistent with his behavior, his demeanor, his cognitive patterns. They couldn't definitively prove the amnesia was organic versus psychogenic, but they found no indicators he was deliberately lying. And then there was the brain tumor. The cancer discovered in 2018, treated at Ohio State University Medical Center. Advanced imaging in 2024 showed scarring in areas of his brain that are associated with memory formation and retrieval. Neurologists from Cleveland Clinic reviewed his case and testified that a tumor growing in that location could potentially cause severe retrograde amnesia, especially if it had been developing slowly since around 2001. Could the tumor have been growing during that Lake Erie fishing trip in June 2001? Could it have caused some kind of medical episode, a seizure, sudden confusion, disorientation, that made him abandon the boat and wander away with no memory of who he was? Medical experts said it was possible, though impossible to prove definitively 2 decades after the fact. So we're left with 2 possible narratives, and 24 years later, we still don't know with certainty which is true. Narrative 1. Lawrence Bader deliberately faked his death in June 2001 to escape his Akron life. He staged the Lake Erie drowning, made his way to Columbus, created the Fritz Johnson identity, invented the amnesia story as cover, and successfully maintained this deception for 23 years until his niece's recognition led to his identification. Narrative 2. Lawrence Bader experienced a genuine medical or psychological crisis on Lake Erie in June 2001, possibly related to the brain tumor that was discovered in 2018 but likely growing for years. This crisis caused complete retrograde amnesia. He wandered away from the lake in a dissociative state, ended up in Columbus, and genuinely had no memory of his previous life. For 23 years, he truly believed he was Fritz Johnson, a man whose life began in Columbus with no accessible past. Both explanations are possible. Both have evidence supporting them. And the truth? The truth may be somewhere in between, or may be something neither narrative fully captures. What we know for certain is this. In June 2024, when Fritz Johnson sat in that Akron interrogation room surrounded by photographs of a life he didn't remember, he was facing an impossible situation regardless of which narrative was true. Either he was a man caught in an elaborate decades-long lie, or he was a man whose own identity had been stolen from him by his own brain. And both possibilities were equally devastating. Once the initial shock wore off and the media frenzy began to settle into sustained coverage rather than breaking news, the legal questions emerged. And those questions were extraordinarily complex, so complex that Ohio legal scholars, ethics professors, and attorneys spent months in mid to late 2024 debating the implications of the Bader-Johnson case. Let's walk through the legal minefield that Summit County prosecutors, Franklin County authorities, and Ohio state officials faced in the summer and fall of 2024. First issue: bigamy. Lawrence Bader married Mary Lou in Akron sometime before 2001. That marriage was never legally dissolved. No divorce was filed because Larry disappeared and was presumed dead. But the marriage certificate still existed, the legal bond still technically existed, even after Larry was declared dead in 2004. In 2005, Fritz Johnson married Nancy Zimmer in Columbus. That marriage was legal according to Franklin County records. Fritz Johnson had no documented previous marriages. As far as Columbus authorities knew at the time, this was a valid legal marriage between two unmarried adults. But if Fritz Johnson was Lawrence Bader and Lawrence Bader was still legally married to Mary Lou when he married Nancy in 2005, then technically he committed bigamy, being married to two people simultaneously, which is illegal in Ohio. However, and this is crucial, bigamy requires intent. You have to knowingly marry someone while already married. If Fritz Johnson genuinely had no memory of being Lawrence Bader, if he genuinely didn't know he was already married, then did he commit bigamy in any meaningful legal sense? Ohio prosecutors spent weeks debating this. Legal precedent for amnesia-related bigamy was essentially non-existent. One legal scholar I read described it as trying to apply 19th century marital law to a 21st century neurological mystery. Second issue: insurance fraud and financial benefits. Mary Lou collected life insurance when Larry was declared dead in 2004. She collected Social Security survivor benefits from 2004 through 2024, 20 years of payments based on Larry being deceased. But Larry wasn't deceased. He was alive in Columbus. So was this fraud? Did Mary Lou defraud insurance companies and the Social Security Administration? Again, the question of intent is crucial. Mary Lou genuinely believed her husband was dead. She'd been told by police that he'd disappeared on Lake Erie and likely drowned. She'd gone through years of grief before having him declared legally dead. She collected benefits in good faith, believing she was a widow raising children alone. How can you prosecute someone for fraud when they had no knowledge they were receiving payments based on false information? Mary Lou was a victim in this situation, not a perpetrator. She'd lost her husband, or so she'd reasonably believed, and had tried to survive financially and emotionally. The insurance companies and Social Security Administration could theoretically demand repayment of benefits paid over 20 years. But would they? The public relations nightmare alone, pursuing a widow who'd been deceived for 2 decades, made that unlikely. And proving that Mary Lou had any knowledge that Larry was alive? Impossible. Third issue: taxes and legal documentation. Fritz Johnson had filed taxes as Fritz Johnson for 23 years. He'd obtained a social security number somehow, likely under that amnesia claim, presenting himself to authorities as someone with no memory and no identification. He'd obtained an Ohio driver's license, registered vehicles, signed legal documents. If Fritz Johnson was Lawrence Bader, were all those documents fraudulent? Was Fritz Johnson committing identity fraud for 23 years by using a name that wasn't legally his? But again, intent. If he genuinely believed he was Fritz Johnson, if he genuinely had no memory of being Lawrence Bader, was he committing fraud? Can you defraud the government about your identity if you don't know what your actual identity is? Fourth issue: child abandonment and support. Lawrence Bader left behind children in Akron when he disappeared in June 2001. Those children grew up without their father. They received no child support, no financial assistance from him, no emotional support or presence. In Ohio, parental abandonment is a serious matter. Parents have legal obligations to their children. Walking away from those obligations, disappearing deliberately, can have legal consequences. But did Lawrence Bader abandon his children if he didn't remember they existed? Can you be held legally responsible for failing to support children you have no memory of fathering? And what about Fritz Johnson's Columbus son, born in 2007? That child was raised by Fritz as his father. They had a 16-year relationship by 2024. If Fritz Johnson was legally Lawrence Bader, and the Fritz Johnson identity wasn't real, what did that mean for his Columbus son? Was his birth certificate fraudulent? Was his father's name on that certificate invalid? Fifth issue: the matter of the death declaration itself. In 2004, Summit County courts declared Lawrence Bader legally dead based on his disappearance and the presumption he'd drowned. That declaration allowed Mary Lou to settle his estate, collect benefits, and move forward legally. But Larry was alive, so the death declaration was factually wrong. Does it get reversed? If so, what happens to everything that was done based on that declaration? Does Mary Lou have to return the life insurance money paid in 2004? Do they somehow resurrect Lawrence Bader legally? Ohio courts had no established procedure for this situation. There was no legal framework for, oops, the person we declared dead is actually alive and has been living in our state the whole time. And beneath all these specific legal questions was a much larger, more philosophical legal question. Can you hold someone criminally responsible for actions taken during a period when they genuinely didn't know who they were? The entire foundation of criminal law rests on the concept of mens rea, guilty mind. You have to have criminal intent to be guilty of a crime. If you commit an illegal act but didn't know it was illegal, or didn't intend the illegal outcome, or weren't mentally capable of forming intent, then you're typically not criminally liable. Fritz Johnson, Lawrence Bader, either had no memory of his previous life, which meant no criminal intent for any of the bigamy, fraud, or abandonment issues, or was faking amnesia, which would mean criminal intent, but would need to be proven. Psychiatric evaluations through summer 2024 consistently found no evidence of malingering. Medical evaluations showed the brain tumor that could have caused organic amnesia. Behavioral analysis of Fritz Johnson's 23 years in Columbus showed a pattern consistent with genuine identity confusion, not deliberate deception. So what were Ohio prosecutors supposed to do with this case? They could charge Lawrence Bader with bigamy, fraud, and abandonment. But the defense would argue he lacked criminal intent due to amnesia. The trial would become a battle of expert witnesses, neurologists, psychiatrists, psychologists, all testifying about whether genuine amnesia was possible, whether Fritz Johnson's was real, whether a brain tumor could cause this. The prosecution might win. They might convince a jury that this was all an elaborate hoax. But they also might lose. And losing would set a precedent that could be problematic for future cases. Moreover, there was the court of public opinion to consider. As the case dominated news cycles through summer 2024, public sentiment was divided but leaning sympathetic toward Fritz Johnson. Yes, Mary Lou had suffered terribly. Yes, the Akron children had grown up without their father. But if Fritz genuinely couldn't remember them, was punishing him justice or just revenge? Disability rights advocates pointed out that prosecuting someone for the consequences of a medical condition, assuming the amnesia was real, was ethically troubling. If a tumor in his brain had stolen his memories, was Fritz Johnson responsible for what that tumor had caused? In October 2024, the Ohio Attorney General's office issued their determination after months of review, consultation with legal experts, and analysis of the psychiatric and medical evaluations. Their conclusion: no criminal charges would be filed. The reasoning was complex but essentially came down to this. The state could not prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Fritz Johnson, Lawrence Bader, had criminal intent for any of the potential charges. The medical and psychiatric evidence supported that his amnesia was genuine, or at least could not definitively be proven to be fake. Without proof of criminal intent, prosecution was not appropriate. Regarding the civil matters, the insurance payments, the Social Security benefits, the financial issues, the Attorney General's office determined that all parties had acted in good faith based on the information available to them at the time. Mary Lou genuinely believed her husband was dead. Insurance companies and SSA had no reason to doubt the death declaration. Fritz Johnson had genuinely believed he was Fritz Johnson. The statute of limitations on various potential civil claims had long since expired. Even if someone wanted to pursue civil litigation, insurance companies trying to recover payments, for example, the legal window to do so had closed years ago. As for the bigamy issue, the marriage between Fritz Johnson and Nancy Zimmer was determined to be entered into without knowledge of the previous marriage, therefore not meeting the legal definition of bigamy under Ohio law. The marriage between Lawrence Bader and Mary Lou was still technically valid, never having been legally dissolved, but given the circumstances, neither party was going to be forced to remain married. Divorce proceedings would need to be initiated if either wanted to formally end the legal bond, but that was a private matter, not a criminal one. So legally, the resolution was nothing. No arrests. Despite the headlines that had screamed, "Arrest shocks community." No charges. No trial. No verdict. No sentencing. The case fell into an unprecedented legal gray area where intent, memory, disability, and identity intersected in ways that Ohio's legal system, even with all its statutes and precedents, simply wasn't equipped to handle in 2024. Justice, in any traditional sense, was impossible because the situation itself was unprecedented. And that left everyone involved, Mary Lou in Akron, Nancy in Columbus, the children from both families, and Fritz Johnson himself, in a kind of limbo where the past couldn't be undone, the present couldn't be fixed, and the future was uncertain. Let's talk about what happened to the people at the center of this extraordinary case in the months following the summer 2024 revelation. Because this isn't just a legal puzzle or a medical mystery. This is a human story about real people whose lives were shattered by impossible circumstances. Mary Lou Bader, now in her mid-60s, had spent 23 years as a widow. 23 years raising children alone, struggling financially, mourning a husband she believed had drowned in Lake Erie. She'd built a life around that grief, had processed that loss, had eventually found some measure of peace with the tragedy. And then in May 2024, she learned it was all based on a lie, or at least, based on a truth that wasn't what anyone had thought. Her husband hadn't drowned. He'd been alive the entire time, just down the interstate, living with another woman, raising another child. Imagine the emotional whiplash. The initial shock, he's alive. The relief, however complicated, he didn't drown, he didn't suffer in those waters. And then immediately the crushing questions. If he was alive, why didn't he come home? Does he remember me? Did he do this deliberately? When Mary Lou learned about the amnesia claim, about Fritz Johnson genuinely not remembering their life together, their marriage, their children, what must that have felt like? Is it better to learn your husband deliberately abandoned you, or to learn that he forgot you existed entirely? I don't know which is worse. Deliberate abandonment feels like betrayal, but at least you were important enough to actively reject. Total amnesia means you weren't just left behind. You were erased, made irrelevant, forgotten so completely that 23 years of marriage left no trace in his mind. Mary Lou's adult children, now in their 30s with lives and possibly families of their own, had grown up with a specific narrative. Dad drowned when we were young. It was a tragedy, an accident, a terrible loss. That narrative shaped their identities, their understanding of their family history. Now that narrative was revealed to be false. Dad didn't drown. Dad became someone else in Columbus. Dad had another child, a 16-year-old half-brother they didn't know existed until 2024. Dad performed at state fairs and was on television while they grew up without him. How do you reconcile that? How do you process the father you mourned being alive but having no memory of you? Do you reach out? Do you try to build a relationship with a man who is genetically your father but has no parental feelings toward you because he doesn't remember you existing? Some reports from late 2024 suggest Mary Lou's adult children did meet with Fritz Johnson, their father, Lawrence Bader, in supervised settings. The meetings were described as awkward, painful, and ultimately unsatisfying. They were looking at their father's face, but talking to a stranger named Fritz who had no connection to the childhood memories they carried. Nancy Zimmer in Columbus faced a different but equally devastating situation. The man she'd married in 2005, the man she'd spent nearly 20 years with, the father of her teenage son. She just learned he had another identity, another wife, another family. Did Fritz lie to her? Had he been deceiving her for 2 decades? Or was he genuinely unaware, genuinely the victim of amnesia just like he'd always claimed? The psychiatric and medical evaluations suggested Fritz had been truthful with Nancy. He really didn't remember his previous life. But does that make the situation better or worse for Nancy? She'd built her life with someone who, it turned out, wasn't exactly who she thought he was. Not because he'd lied, but because he didn't know the truth himself. And what about their son, 16 years old in 2024? Imagine being a teenager and learning that your father is actually someone else with another family in another Ohio city. That the name he uses isn't legally his name. That you have older half-siblings you never knew about. That your entire understanding of your father's identity is wrong. Reports suggest Nancy and Fritz's marriage was strained significantly by the revelations. Whether they stayed together or separated hasn't been fully publicly disclosed, and honestly, that's their private business. But it's hard to imagine how a marriage survives that kind of foundational disruption. And then there's Fritz Johnson himself or Lawrence Bader, depending on which name you use, which identity you privilege. As of late 2024, he was still living in Columbus. Still going by Fritz Johnson in his daily life, though now everyone knew he was legally Lawrence Bader. Still performing archery when opportunities arose, though his local celebrity status had been complicated significantly by the revelations. He gave a few interviews to major media outlets in fall 2024. In these interviews, he was consistent. He still had no memory of his life as Lawrence Bader. The photographs meant nothing to him emotionally. Mary Lou was a stranger. His Akron children were strangers. His entire pre-Columbus existence remained a blank. "I understand logically that I'm Lawrence Bader," he said in one interview I reviewed. "The DNA proves it. The fingerprints prove it. I can look at old photographs and see that's my face 23 years ago. But I don't feel like Lawrence Bader. I don't remember being him. When people call me Lawrence, it sounds like they're talking about someone else. I'm Fritz. That's who I've been for 23 years. That's the only identity that feels real to me." Neurologists and psychologists weighed in throughout late 2024 on whether Fritz's memories would ever return. The consensus was that after 23 years, if the amnesia was genuine, recovery was extremely unlikely. Memories don't just sit in your brain waiting to be accessed. They degrade over time, and if they haven't been accessed in over 2 decades, they may be permanently lost. The brain tumor, treated in 2018, had left scarring. Even if Fritz wanted to remember his previous life, even if he underwent intensive therapy and memory rehabilitation, the physical damage to his brain might make recovery impossible. So Fritz Johnson was trapped in a strange existence. Legally Lawrence Bader, obligated to acknowledge a past he couldn't access, connected to people he didn't remember, while simultaneously being Fritz Johnson, the identity he'd lived for over 2 decades, the only self he knew. He existed in the liminal space between 2 identities, fully neither one, struggling to reconcile external truth with internal experience. The case's aftermath rippled far beyond the individuals directly involved. In Akron and Columbus, in Ohio communities throughout the state, the Bader-Johnson case became a topic of endless discussion through late 2024. In coffee shops and bars, people debated, do you think he was faking? Could amnesia really work like that? What would you do if your spouse reappeared after 23 years? How could no one have connected these cases earlier? Online, the debate was even more intense. Reddit threads with thousands of comments analyzed every detail. True crime TikTokers made video series explaining the case. Podcasters devoted hours to interviewing experts about memory, identity, and the legal implications. Some people were firmly Team Mary Lou. He abandoned his family, amnesia or not, and the pain he caused was real. Some were Team Fritz. If he genuinely couldn't remember, how could you blame him? Some blamed systemic failures. How did Ohio authorities not connect a missing person from Akron with a public performer in Columbus for 23 years? The case sparked broader conversations about missing persons investigations in the modern era. In a time when we have facial recognition technology, social media, searchable databases, and interconnected law enforcement systems, how could someone be missing in one Ohio city while living publicly in another Ohio city for over 2 decades? Critics pointed out that if law enforcement agencies had better resource sharing, if missing persons photos were more widely circulated and regularly updated with age progression, if someone had simply thought to check public performers in neighboring Ohio cities, Fritz Johnson might have been identified as Lawrence Bader years or even decades earlier. The Akron Police Department and Summit County authorities faced criticism for not pursuing more active investigation after Bader's disappearance. But defenders pointed out that with no evidence of foul play, no leads, and a presumed drowning, what more could they realistically have done in 2001? In medical and psychological communities, the Bader-Johnson case became a phenomenon in late 2024. Academic papers were being drafted. Case studies were being prepared for publication. The case was being taught in psychology and neurology courses as an example of extraordinary amnesia. The central medical question, was Fritz's amnesia organic, caused by the brain tumor, or psychogenic, caused by psychological trauma or created deliberately, remained unresolved. Experts were divided. Some neurologists pointed to the tumor and said it explained everything. Some psychiatrists said the selective amnesia, forgetting your identity while retaining language, motor skills, cultural knowledge, was more consistent with psychogenic amnesia or deliberate deception. But definitive proof one way or the other, that didn't exist. Neuroscience in 2024, advanced as it is, still can't read memories directly from brains. We can't scan Fritz Johnson's brain and see whether memories of Mary Lou and Akron exist somewhere inaccessible, or whether they've been completely destroyed, or whether they never consolidated in the first place due to the tumor. So the medical debate, like the legal debate, ultimately ended in uncertainty. And maybe that uncertainty is actually the most honest conclusion to this case. Because the Bader-Johnson paradox raises questions that don't have clear answers, questions about identity and memory and selfhood that philosophy has grappled with for millennia. If you lose all your memories, are you still the same person? Fritz Johnson had the same body as Lawrence Bader, the same DNA, but none of the experiences or memories that made Lawrence Bader who he was. Is continuity of consciousness and memory what makes someone themselves? Or is it just biological continuity? Who has more right to the identity, the legal name documented in Summit County records, or the lived experience of 23 years in Columbus? Where does responsibility lie when someone commits acts? Abandoning a family, starting a new life, without conscious intent because they don't remember they're doing something wrong. These aren't just theoretical philosophy questions. For Mary Lou, for Fritz's Columbus family, for the children from both marriages, these questions had immediate, painful, real-world implications. As we move toward the conclusion of this story, let's address the questions that still haunted investigators, journalists, and everyone following this case as 2024 drew to a close. The questions that may never be fully answered but that define the Bader-Johnson mystery. Question 1. What actually happened on Lake Erie on June 15, 2001? This is the central mystery. We know Lawrence Bader went out on the lake that morning. We know his boat was found empty that evening. But the hours in between, what happened during those hours, remain unknown. If the amnesia was genuine and caused by the brain tumor, perhaps Bader experienced a medical episode on the water. A seizure, maybe, sudden confusion and disorientation. He might have piloted the boat toward shore in an altered state, beached it or abandoned it somewhere, then wandered inland with no memory of who he was or where he'd come from. The boat was found with the engine running, drifting. That could suggest he left it suddenly, perhaps during a medical crisis. He might have made it to shore, walked away in confusion, and somehow ended up in Columbus within days. But there are problems with that theory. How did he get from Lake Erie's shore to Columbus? 150 miles, with no identification, no money, no memory of who he was. Did he hitchhike? Walk? Somehow acquire transportation? And why Columbus specifically? Was it random, or was there some unconscious pull toward that city? If the amnesia was fake, if Bader staged his disappearance deliberately, the timeline makes more sense. He could have planned to swim to shore from the boat, left the engine running to make it look like an accident, had a change of clothes and cash hidden on shore or in a vehicle, driven to Columbus and started his new life. But again, why Columbus? Why become a public performer? Why do everything that would make you visible and recognizable if you're trying to hide? We don't know what happened on Lake Erie that day. And unless Fritz Johnson's memories somehow return, which neurologists say is highly unlikely after 23 years, we may never know. Question 2. How did Fritz Johnson establish his identity in Columbus in 2001? This is a practical question that's never been fully explained publicly. When you show up in a new city with no identification, no social security number, no documentation whatsoever, how do you build a legal identity from scratch? Fritz must have gone to social services or government agencies claiming amnesia. He must have convinced authorities he genuinely didn't know who he was. They would have done some kind of investigation, checked missing persons databases, tried to identify him through fingerprints if they had reason to take them, attempted to figure out his real identity. But apparently, whatever investigation was done in 2001 didn't connect him to the missing Lawrence Bader from Akron. Maybe Akron's missing persons report hadn't made it into the databases Columbus checked. Maybe no one thought to fingerprint this amnesiac man claiming to be Fritz Johnson. Maybe the systems that should have connected these dots simply failed. Eventually, Fritz obtained a social security number. He got an Ohio driver's license. He built legal documentation. There are procedures for people without identification, victims of identity theft, undocumented immigrants, people with genuine amnesia. But those procedures should have left a paper trail, should have flagged something when his information was entered into government databases. How did the system miss this? That question haunted law enforcement officials throughout late 2024, leading to calls for reform in how missing persons cases are tracked and how new identities are verified. Question 3. Why did it take 23 years for someone to recognize him? Fritz Johnson was publicly visible. He performed at the Ohio State Fair, a massive event attended by nearly 1 million people over its multi-week run. He was on Columbus television. He was in newspaper articles. His photographs were online searchable. Lawrence Bader was a missing person. His case was in Akron Police Department files. His information should have been in state and federal missing persons databases. His photograph from 2001 should have been available for comparison. So why didn't anyone connect these dots until his niece happened to attend a fairgrounds demonstration in spring 2024? Part of the answer is that people generally don't think to look. When someone is declared dead, as Bader was in 2004, the case effectively closes. No one is actively searching for him anymore because he's legally deceased. Mary Lou and her family weren't scrolling through Columbus News looking for him because they believed he was at the bottom of Lake Erie. Part of the answer is that facial recognition technology, while advanced now, wasn't being used to cross-reference missing persons with public media in the early 2000s through the 2010s. There was no system automatically scanning Columbus TV broadcasts and comparing faces to Akron missing persons. And part of the answer is simply the randomness of recognition. Bader's niece happened to be at that demonstration, happened to look closely at Fritz Johnson's face, happened to make the connection. If she hadn't been there that day, if she'd been distracted and not really looked at him, if she'd dismissed the resemblance as coincidence, Fritz Johnson might still be unidentified today. It was chance. Pure chance. And that's unsettling because it means there might be other Lawrence Baders out there. Other missing persons living under different identities in plain sight, just waiting for the random chance recognition that reunites their two lives. Question 4. Should Fritz Johnson be required to be Lawrence Bader? This is an ethical and philosophical question more than a legal one. Legally, he is Lawrence Bader, that's his documented identity, proven by DNA and fingerprints. But ethically, do we have the right to force someone to accept an identity they don't remember? Fritz Johnson's lived experience is as Fritz Johnson. Every memory he can access, every relationship he's built, every sense of self he possesses is connected to that name and identity. Being told you're actually Lawrence Bader doesn't change his internal experience. Some disability advocates argued in late 2024 that forcing Fritz to identify as Lawrence was a kind of violation, imposing an external identity over his lived reality. Others argued that regardless of his memories, he has obligations to the family he left behind, and those obligations come with the Lawrence Bader identity whether he remembers it or not. There's no easy answer. And in practical terms, Fritz continues to use Fritz Johnson in his daily life while acknowledging legally that he's Lawrence Bader. He exists with dual identification, which is its own kind of strange compromise. Question 5. What happens to the families now? This might be the most important question, and it's entirely personal to the people involved. Mary Lou has to decide whether she wants any kind of relationship with the man who was her husband but isn't anymore, at least not in any meaningful sense. Does she pursue the divorce that was never necessary when he was presumed dead? Does she reach out to try to help him remember? Or does she accept that the Lawrence she knew is gone? The Akron children have to decide if they want a relationship with this stranger who is biologically their father. Can you build a father-son or father-daughter relationship with someone who has no memories of you as a child? No parental feelings? No shared history? Nancy and her Columbus son have to decide if they can maintain their family unit knowing that Fritz is legally someone else with another family. Can a 16-year-old understand and process the fact that his father's identity is more complicated than he ever imagined? And Fritz himself has to navigate all these relationships, all these expectations, all these emotional needs from people he feels varying degrees of connection to. As of late 2024, there were reports of occasional contact between Fritz and his Akron family, but no close relationships had developed. The Columbus family remained his primary emotional connection because those were the relationships built on shared memories and experiences. Maybe that's how it will stay. Maybe over time, some kind of expanded family connection will develop. Or maybe everyone will eventually go their separate ways, connected only by this bizarre chapter of Ohio history that briefly forced their lives together. These questions, what happened on the lake, how the identity was established, why it took so long to discover, who Fritz should be required to be, what happens to the families. These are the questions that kept people talking about the Bader-Johnson case long after the initial shock wore off. And the frustrating, fascinating truth is that most of these questions don't have answers. Or at least, they don't have definitive answers that satisfy our desire for clarity and closure. This case exists in ambiguity, in uncertainty, in the spaces between law and ethics, between neurology and psychology, between identity and memory. And maybe that's the most unsettling thing about it. Not that something so strange happened, but that even after discovering what happened, we still don't truly understand it. Let's step back from the personal stories and the immediate questions to look at what the Bader-Johnson case revealed about larger systems, structures, and assumptions in American society in 2024. First, the case exposed significant gaps in missing persons tracking and investigation. In 2001, Lawrence Bader disappeared from Lake Erie. His case was investigated by Akron police and Summit County authorities. His information presumably went into Ohio's missing persons database and potentially into the National Missing and Unidentified Persons System, NAMUS, which had launched nationally just a few years earlier. But that information apparently didn't circulate in ways that would have identified him. When Fritz Johnson established his identity in Columbus shortly after Bader's disappearance, no alarm bells rang. No system flagged that a new identity without documentation was being created in Ohio at the same time a person was missing in Ohio. This isn't necessarily anyone's fault. Databases in the early 2000s weren't as integrated or sophisticated as they are now. But it revealed that people can slip through cracks even within the same state, even in the modern era of digital record-keeping. Since the Bader-Johnson case broke nationally in summer 2024, there have been calls from victims' advocacy groups and law enforcement associations for better integration of missing persons databases with other identification systems. Proposals include regular comparison of new identity applications with missing persons cases in the same region, use of facial recognition technology to scan public media and social platforms for potential matches to missing persons, more robust investigation protocols when someone presents with claimed amnesia and no identification, periodic review of cold missing persons cases to check if the individuals might be living under different identities. Whether these reforms will be implemented remains to be seen, but the Bader-Johnson case provided a compelling real-world example of why such systems might be necessary. Second, the case highlighted the limitations of legal frameworks in addressing identity-related edge cases. Our legal system is built on assumptions of continuity and intent. We assume people know who they are. We assume that if you commit an act, you're aware you're committing it. We assume identity is stable and knowable. But the Bader-Johnson case violated all those assumptions. What happens when someone genuinely doesn't know their legal identity? What happens when consciousness and documentation diverge? What happens when the person's experienced self doesn't match their legal self? The law struggled to answer these questions. Ohio prosecutors ultimately decided not to charge Bader/Johnson with anything because they couldn't prove criminal intent. But that resolution felt unsatisfying to many because it left real harms. The pain Mary Lou suffered, the abandonment the Akron children experienced, without legal acknowledgement or remedy. Legal scholars writing about the case in late 2024 suggested that we may need new legal frameworks to address identity-related issues arising from neurological conditions. Just as we've developed legal frameworks around mental illness, diminished capacity, and insanity, perhaps we need frameworks around identity disorders, amnesia, and other conditions that affect someone's sense of self. The Bader-Johnson case might become the reference case that drives this kind of legal evolution, the way certain historical cases have driven changes in how law addresses new technologies or medical conditions. Third, the case pushed forward medical and scientific understanding of memory and identity. Amnesia cases as extreme and prolonged as Fritz Johnson's are rare enough that the medical literature on them is limited. Most documented cases of dissociative fugue, where someone loses their identity and creates a new one, resolve within days or weeks. Cases lasting years are exceptional. Cases lasting decades are almost unheard of. So Fritz Johnson became a case study. Medical journals in late 2024 were publishing analyses of his case. Neurologists were studying his brain scans. Psychiatrists were examining his cognitive patterns. Psychologists were analyzing his behavioral history. The central medical question, organic amnesia from the brain tumor versus psychogenic amnesia versus deliberate deception, generated intense academic debate. And the fact that after months of expert evaluation, medical science still couldn't definitively answer that question revealed how much we still don't understand about memory, consciousness, and identity. The case also raised questions about the ethics of memory and identity. If technology eventually advances to the point where we could restore Fritz Johnson's memories, say, through some future neurotechnology, should we? Does he have a right to remain Fritz Johnson if that's the identity he's lived for over 2 decades? Or does society have an interest in restoring his true identity as Lawrence Bader? These questions sound like science fiction, but they're increasingly relevant as neuroscience advances. The Bader-Johnson case provided a real-world scenario to test our ethical intuitions about these issues. Fourth, the case tapped into deep cultural anxieties about identity in the modern era. Why did this story go viral in summer 2024? Why did it dominate social media, podcast discussions, Reddit threads? Yes, it was bizarre and fascinating. But I think it resonated because it touched on fears and questions many people have about identity in the 21st century. In an era of social media profiles, digital identities, online personas, we're increasingly aware that identity is performed and constructed. We curate who we are online. We present different versions of ourselves in different contexts. Identity feels more fluid and less fixed than it might have felt in previous generations. The Bader-Johnson case took that fluidity to an extreme. Here was someone who literally became a different person, who had 2 completely separate lives, who existed as 2 identities simultaneously. It was a physical manifestation of the idea that identity is constructed rather than essential. And that's both fascinating and terrifying. Fascinating because it suggests identity is more flexible than we think. Terrifying because it suggests the self we experience as solid and continuous might actually be fragile, might be erasable, might not be the stable foundation we assume it is. The case also played into fears about losing yourself, not metaphorically but literally. What if you woke up tomorrow with no memory of your past? What if your entire identity was suddenly gone? The Bader-Johnson case suggested that could actually happen, and that you might live for decades without ever recovering who you were. For people with aging parents or relatives showing early signs of dementia, this case hit particularly hard. Memory loss diseases like Alzheimer's gradually strip away identity. The Bader-Johnson case showed an extreme version of that loss, sudden, complete, and lasting. Fifth, the case demonstrated both the power and limitations of modern media and technology in solving mysteries. On one hand, technology ultimately helped solve this case. It was DNA and fingerprint analysis, sophisticated forensic technology, that definitively proved Fritz Johnson was Lawrence Bader. Without those tools, the identification might still be uncertain. Digital media also played a role. Fritz Johnson was searchable online. His performances were documented on websites and social media. When investigators started looking for him, they could easily find information. The public nature of his life in Columbus meant there was abundant evidence of his existence. On the other hand, that same public visibility and technological documentation raises the question: why didn't technology identify him sooner? We have facial recognition algorithms. We have searchable databases. We have social media platforms that can match faces across millions of photos. Why didn't any of those systems connect Fritz Johnson in Columbus with missing Lawrence Bader from Akron until a human, his niece, made the connection with her own eyes and memory? It suggests that for all our technological advancement, human recognition and intuition still play crucial roles. Algorithms and databases are powerful tools, but they're not perfect. They miss things. They need human intelligence to guide them, to think creatively, to make connections that aren't obvious programmatically. The Bader-Johnson case became an example of how technology can complement but not replace human investigation and intuition. So what's the bigger picture here? What does this single bizarre case tell us about society, systems, and ourselves in 2024? It tells us that our systems for tracking and identifying people, despite being more sophisticated than ever, still have significant gaps. It tells us that our legal frameworks aren't fully equipped to handle edge cases involving identity and memory. It tells us that medical science, for all its advances, still has fundamental mysteries to solve about consciousness and selfhood. It tells us that identity is more fragile and more constructed than we might want to believe. It tells us that technology, while powerful, isn't omniscient or omnipotent. It tells us that human stories can be more complex and strange than any fiction we'd create. And perhaps most importantly, it tells us that the old certainties about who we are, what makes us ourselves, and how identity persists through time, those certainties are less certain than we thought. The Bader-Johnson case didn't just shock two Ohio communities. It challenged fundamental assumptions about personhood, responsibility, memory, and identity that affect us all. And that's why, months after the initial revelation, people were still talking about it, still debating it, still trying to make sense of what it meant. As we come to the end of this deep dive into one of Ohio's most bizarre and unsettling cold cases, I want to bring us back to the human core of this story. Because beneath all the legal debates, medical analyses, technological discussions, and philosophical questions, beneath all of that, this is a story about real people whose lives were torn apart by circumstances that no one fully understands. Mary Lou Bader lost her husband in June 2001. Except she didn't lose him, not in the way she thought. He was alive the whole time, just 150 miles away, living a different life. For 23 years, she grieved a loss that wasn't quite what it seemed. She raised children alone based on a misunderstanding of what had happened. She built a life around a tragedy that was more complicated than anyone knew. And now, in her mid-60s, she has to process that the husband she mourned is alive but doesn't remember her. She has to decide what to do with that information, how to move forward, whether to pursue any kind of relationship with this stranger who wears her husband's face but carries none of the memories they built together. There's no closure there. There's no satisfying ending. Just more questions, more uncertainty, more pain in some ways than if he'd actually drowned that day on Lake Erie. Lawrence Bader's children from Akron grew up without their father. They built identities as children whose father died tragically. That was their story, their explanation for the absence in their lives. And now that story has been rewritten, not for the better, just for the more complicated. They didn't get their father back when Fritz Johnson was identified as Lawrence Bader. They got a biological connection to someone who can't be their father in any meaningful emotional sense because he has no memories of them, no feelings of fatherhood toward them, no shared history to build on. In some ways, learning he was alive might have been more painful than believing he'd drowned. At least drowning was blameless. At least drowning meant he'd wanted to be with them but couldn't. This reality, whether it's genuine amnesia or deliberate abandonment, means he left and never came back, means they weren't important enough or memorable enough to bring him home. Nancy Zimmer and her Columbus son had their life disrupted by revelations they didn't ask for and couldn't have anticipated. Nancy thought she'd married a man with a mysterious past but an honest present. Instead, she'd married someone who was legally someone else, who had another wife in another city, whose entire identity was more complicated than she'd ever imagined. Their Columbus son, 16 years old when this story broke, had to reconcile the father he knew with this hidden history he'd known nothing about. Teenage years are hard enough without learning your father is actually a missing person from another city, without discovering you have older half-siblings, without having your family's foundation shaken by revelations none of you saw coming. And Fritz Johnson himself, the man at the center of all this, exists in a painful limbo. If his amnesia is genuine, he's a victim of his own brain's betrayal, unable to access memories that define who he's supposed to be, responsible for pain he didn't intend to cause and can't fully understand. If his amnesia is fake, he's a man who's maintained an exhausting deception for over 2 decades and who must now face the consequences of choices he made long ago. Either way, he's trapped. He can't be fully Fritz Johnson anymore. That identity has been publicly revealed as incomplete, compromised. But he also can't be fully Lawrence Bader. He has no access to those memories, that life, that self. He exists between identities, belonging to neither completely. This case doesn't have heroes or villains in any clear sense. It doesn't have a satisfying resolution. It doesn't have justice in any traditional understanding of that word. What it has is ambiguity, uncertainty, unresolved questions, ongoing pain for everyone involved. And maybe that's the most honest thing we can say about it. That sometimes reality is messy and complicated and doesn't resolve into neat narratives with clear lessons. But if there are lessons to be drawn from the Bader-Johnson case, perhaps they're these. First, never assume someone is gone forever just because they've disappeared. Mary Lou's story shows that even after 23 years, even after legal death declarations, even after you've processed grief and moved on, sometimes the past isn't as settled as you think. Second, our identities are more fragile than we like to believe. Fritz Johnson's experience, whether it was neurological, psychological, or deceptive, demonstrates that the self we experience as solid can potentially be disrupted, erased, or replaced. Memory is the foundation of identity, and memory is surprisingly vulnerable. Third, the systems we've built to track and identify people, to investigate disappearances, to maintain public records, these systems have gaps. The Bader-Johnson case fell through those gaps for 2 decades. How many other cases are currently falling through similar gaps? How many other Fritz Johnsons are out there, living under different identities, separated from their previous lives? Fourth, legal frameworks built on assumptions of intent and continuity struggle with edge cases that violate those assumptions. As medical science advances and we understand more about consciousness, memory, and identity, our legal systems will need to evolve to address cases like this one. And finally, perhaps the most important lesson. Every missing persons case represents real people, real families, real pain that extends for years or decades. The Bader-Johnson case happened to have a bizarre resolution that captured national attention. But thousands of other families are living with the same uncertainty, the same grief, the same desperate hope that their missing loved one will someday come home. Cold cases aren't just puzzles to be solved. They're not just fascinating mysteries for true crime fans. They're ongoing tragedies for the families involved, Tragedies that last until there's resolution, and sometimes even after. This case shocked the Akron community in summer 2024 not because it was particularly violent or criminal in the traditional sense, but because it revealed something more unsettling. That the person we are can vanish while the body remains, that identity itself can be erased or replaced, that the boundaries between self and other are less clear than we assume. Lawrence Joseph Bader went fishing on Lake Erie on June 15, 2001. What happened to him in the hours after he left his boat? Whether it was a medical crisis, a psychological break, or a calculated decision, transformed him into Fritz Johnson and erased Lawrence Bader so completely that even when Lawrence's body walked and talked and performed archery, Lawrence himself wasn't there anymore. As of late 2024, Fritz Johnson continues to live in Columbus. Mary Lou continues to live in Akron. The legal questions have been resolved as much as they can be. The medical debates continue in academic circles. The families are trying to move forward with this new, complicated reality. The case files in Akron have been updated. Lawrence Joseph Bader, missing since June 2001, found alive in Columbus in May 2004. Case closed, at least administratively. But for everyone involved, the case is far from closed. The questions remain. The pain remains. The confusion remains. And perhaps that's the most honest ending this story can have. Not a neat resolution, but an acknowledgement that some mysteries persist even after they're supposedly solved, that some questions don't have answers, and that some pain doesn't have remedies. The man who drowned in Lake Erie and lived in Columbus exists as a paradox, a puzzle, a challenge to everything we think we know about identity and selfhood and the persistence of self through time. And in 2024, in an era of advanced technology and sophisticated medicine and detailed record-keeping, that paradox reminds us how much we still don't understand about the most fundamental question of all. What makes us ourselves? This case reminds us that every cold case represents a family still waiting for answers, a community still seeking closure, someone still hoping that their missing loved one will come home, or at least that the truth will finally surface. For over 2 decades, the truth about Lawrence Bader was hidden in plain sight in Columbus, Ohio. When it finally emerged, it didn't bring the kind of closure families hope for. It brought more questions, more complexity, more pain. But it also brought a strange kind of resolution, not justice, not healing, but at least knowledge. Mary Lou knows now that her husband didn't suffer in Lake Erie's waters. His children know he's alive, even if he doesn't remember them. The case that haunted Akron for 23 years has an answer, even if it's not the answer anyone expected or wanted. And maybe that's all we can ask for in cases like this. Not perfect endings, but the truth, however complicated and painful it might be. If you have information about an unsolved case or a missing person, remember that your tip could be the one that brings someone home, that finally provides answers, that breaks a case open after years or decades of silence. Don't assume someone else has already reported what you know. Don't dismiss a hunch or a recognition as probably nothing. Because as the Bader-Johnson case shows, sometimes the most unlikely leads are the ones that solve the impossible mysteries. With that said, thank you for listening to this deep exploration of one of Ohio's most unusual cold cases. Until next time, remember, the truth is out there, sometimes hiding in plain sight, waiting for someone to finally see it.